We all know the story. The anxious partner gives and gives, clings harder when they feel distance, and the avoidant partner keeps pulling away. But what happens when the script flips, when the anxious one finally walks away? That's the moment the entire dynamic changes. So often people assume that the anxious partner will stay forever, chasing scraps of connection from the avoidant. But here's the truth. Anxious people don't stay anxious forever. At some point, they hit a threshold. They've poured their heart out, bent themselves into knots, and still felt like they were too much or not enough. And then something clicks. When the anxious partner leaves, the avoidant is forced into an experience they've been dodging, the pain of loss. The person who once stretched themselves thin to hold the relationship together is gone, and that absence is deafening. Now, avoidants often feel relief at first. Finally, no pressure, no constant need for reassurance. But as time passes, the silence grows heavier. The texts don't come, the calls don't come. And what was once taken for granted suddenly feels like a missing limb. Meanwhile, the anxious partner who left often finds something they didn't expect: freedom. They realize they were never too much. They simply weren't matched with someone who could meet them in the middle. That discovery can be the most powerful catalyst for growth. Here's the lesson. Leaving isn't about punishment. It's about reclaiming self-worth. And for the avoidant, it can be the wake-up call that no amount of begging or pleading could ever provide. Because sometimes the greatest shift happens not in holding on tighter, but in finally letting go. When the anxious partner finally decides to walk away, something profound happens in the relationship dynamic. For so long, the avoidant has felt in control. They've been the one creating distance, setting the pace, pulling back whenever things felt too close or too demanding. The anxious partner, on the other hand, has been the one chasing, always reaching out, always trying to bridge the gap, always trying to prove their worthiness of love. It's this push and pull that gives the avoidant a sense of power, because the anxious partner has been willing to contort themselves just to keep the connection alive. But the moment the anxious partner walks away, the dynamic shifts entirely. The avoidant no longer holds the upper hand, and the balance of power tips in a way that neither of them could have imagined. At first, it can be shocking for the avoidant. They've become accustomed to a certain predictability. No matter how many times they withdraw, the anxious partner comes running back. No matter how cold they become, the anxious partner fights harder for warmth. But when the anxious one stops running, stops calling, and stops trying to repair what feels broken, the avoidant is suddenly faced with the silence they themselves created. That silence is louder than any argument could ever be. It's the absence of reassurance, the absence of pursuit, the absence of someone who always buffered their emotional distance. What makes this shift so powerful is that the avoidant is often the last person to expect it. They've built their identity around being the one who resists closeness, who fears being trapped, who feels smothered by too much intimacy. And the anxious partner has reinforced that identity by playing the opposite role, pursuing, demanding, longing, insisting on closeness even when it wasn't reciprocated. But when the anxious partner withdraws, the avoidant suddenly has to face a truth they've avoided for years. They weren't being smothered, they were being loved. They weren't being trapped, they were being offered stability. And by pushing it away, they may have lost the very thing they secretly needed. The anxious partner's decision to leave doesn't just change the emotional power structure, it exposes the illusion the avoidant had been living under. For so long, they believed they were the one in control, the one dictating the terms of closeness. But in reality, they were reliant on the anxious partner's persistence to sustain the relationship. Once that persistence disappears, the avoidant realizes just how dependent they were on the very thing they resented. That's why so many avoidants experience regret or longing once the anxious partner leaves. It's not just about missing the person, it's about realizing the entire dynamic they counted on has collapsed. This shift can be deeply unsettling for the avoidant, but it can also be liberating for the anxious partner. For perhaps the first time, the anxious person recognizes the strength in their own choice. They see that they are no longer the one giving their power away. They are no longer waiting for scraps of affection or fighting for crumbs of attention. By walking away, they've altered the entire foundation of the relationship, and that shift leaves both people standing in territory that feels unfamiliar but transformative. When the anxious partner finally walks away, the avoidant often experiences a wave of relief. To them, it feels like the weight has been lifted. The constant calls for reassurance, the questions about where the relationship is going, the need for closeness that always felt overwhelming. All of it suddenly stops. They may even feel a sense of freedom, as though they can finally breathe without the pressure of someone constantly leaning in on them. For a while, this can feel intoxicating. They may convince themselves that this is exactly what they wanted, that space is the solution, that the relationship ending has restored their sense of control. But relief is only the first stage. As days or weeks pass, the silence that felt comforting at first starts to end. The texts they used to roll their eyes at no longer arrive. The phone calls they used to dodge don't come through anymore. The person who once fought so hard to stay in their life has stopped showing up altogether. And this is where the shift begins. The absence of pursuit becomes louder than the presence of pressure ever was. The avoidant begins to notice the void, not because they suddenly crave constant attention, but because the energy they had grown used to has disappeared. What once felt suffocating is now strangely missing. This is where regret often seeps in. The avoidant may begin to replay memories, to think about the small gestures of love and care they overlooked, to notice how much effort was being made on their behalf. They remember the little texts in the morning, the way the anxious partner made plans to keep them connected, the patience shown even when they resisted closeness. And suddenly those things are no longer burdens, they are lost. The very behaviors that once felt like pressure start to be seen for what they truly were, signs of someone deeply invested. That recognition can be painful because it highlights not just the absence of the anxious partner but also the avoidant's role in pushing them away. At this stage, the avoidant may try to convince themselves they don't care. They may lean on distractions, dive into work, or seek out casual connections to fill the gap, but none of it carries the weight of the anxious partner's devotion. They realize that their relief has transformed into emptiness. The relationship, which they once felt had too much intensity, now feels like it had substance they can't easily replace. The predictability of being pursued, the comfort of knowing someone was always there, it may have felt like a burden in the moment, but it provided stability they never acknowledged until it was gone. For the anxious partner, this shift is rarely visible, because by the time they leave, they've often made peace with their decision. But for the avoidant, it can feel like a haunting realization. What they once dismissed as too much was actually the kind of love most people crave. The relief that came with the breakup doesn't last, because the absence reveals a truth that distance had been protecting them from, that they wanted connection all along, even if they were afraid to admit it. When the anxious partner finally makes the decision to walk away, something unexpected happens inside them. For so long, they've lived with the belief that they are too much, too emotional, too needy, too intense in their desire for closeness. Every time they reached out and felt dismissed, every time they asked for reassurance and were met with silence or withdrawal, that belief got reinforced. They began to see themselves as the problem, as though their very need for intimacy was a flaw to be fixed. Walking away breaks that cycle, not because they suddenly stopped wanting closeness, but because they realized the problem wasn't their desire at all. It was the mismatch with someone who couldn't meet them halfway. At first, the anxious partner may feel devastated. They've invested so much into trying to hold the relationship together, to prove that love is worth fighting for, that letting go feels like surrender. But as the dust settles, clarity begins to surface. They start to recognize that their needs are not unreasonable. Wanting connection, consistency, and security isn't being clingy, it's being human. The very things they were shamed for, the things that made them doubt themselves, are in fact the foundation of a healthy relationship. This realization is liberating, because it reframes the entire story they've been telling themselves about who they are and what they deserve. Freedom for the anxious partner doesn't come in the form of being free from love, it comes in the form of being free from self-doubt. They stop carrying the weight of someone else's inability to connect and begin to see their worth outside the push and pull dynamic. Instead of anxiously analyzing every message or interaction, They start to appreciate the peace of no longer second-guessing themselves. They see that they weren't the one who was too much, they were simply with someone who offered too little. And in that shift, a new confidence begins to emerge. This sense of freedom often extends beyond just relationships. When someone has spent years questioning their value, always wondering if they're lovable, finally breaking free from a cycle that reinforced that fear can feel like a rebirth. They may throw themselves into friendships, into hobbies, into passions that had been neglected while they were consumed with keeping the relationship afloat. They find joy in giving their energy to things that give back, instead of pouring endlessly into a cup with holes at the bottom. Perhaps the most powerful change is that the anxious partner begins to trust themselves again. They trust their instincts, their emotions, and their needs, rather than shaming themselves for having them. They realize that what they want, a partner who shows up, who values closeness, who communicates openly, is not only valid but also achievable. This newfound freedom isn't about never feeling anxious again. It's about no longer being trapped in a situation that amplifies their fear. By walking away, they've given themselves the space to grow into security, to find balance, and to attract the kind of love that doesn't make them question whether they are enough. When the anxious partner decides to leave, the act itself is less about walking away from the avoidant and more about walking toward themselves. For so long, they've measured their worth by how much attention or validation they could extract from someone who kept them at arm's length. Every unanswered message or delayed response chipped away at their self-esteem, and every moment of affection felt like proof that maybe they were finally good enough. It's exhausting to live like that, constantly chasing reassurance while battling the quiet fear of being unlovable. But the moment they step back and choose to stop participating in that cycle, something remarkable happens. They reclaim their self-worth. The anxious partner's decision to leave isn't born out of spite. It isn't about punishing the avoidant or teaching them a lesson. It comes from a deeper recognition that continuing to stay would mean abandoning themselves. That recognition is both painful and empowering. Painful because it forces them to admit that the love they wanted isn't available in the relationship, but empowering because it reminds them that they do have a choice. They can stop trying to force something that drains them and instead redirect that energy toward nurturing their own sense of value. Reclaiming self-worth often begins in subtle ways. The anxious partner may notice how much calmer they feel when they're not waiting by the phone for a response. They may realize how freeing it is to express their emotions without the fear of being labeled too much. They begin to set boundaries, not as walls to keep love out, but as a way of ensuring that the love they accept aligns with the respect they deserve. And slowly they come to see themselves not as someone who needs to beg for scraps of affection, but as someone who deserves a full, nourishing relationship. For the avoidant, this can be a shock. They're used to being chased, used to holding the power in the dynamic. When that power is gone, it can create an internal crisis. But for the anxious partner, the absence of that chase is a relief. They no longer have to perform, plead, or prove. They no longer feel defined by how much closeness they can extract from someone unwilling to give it freely. Instead, their sense of self-worth begins to stand on its own, independent of whether someone else validates it. The beauty of this shift is that it often ripples into other parts of their life. The anxious partner may notice they carry themselves differently, that they no longer tolerate one-sided friendships or jobs where they feel undervalued. They start to demand reciprocity, not out of entitlement, but out of an understanding that healthy connections require balance. Their worth is no longer tethered to how much they can endure, but to how much they can honor themselves. And that's the real turning point, when leaving stops feeling like loss and starts feeling like the most self-affirming choice they could have made. When the anxious partner leaves, the breakup becomes more than just the end of a relationship. It becomes a catalyst for transformation. Both people are pushed into uncomfortable but necessary self-reflection. For the avoidant, who has spent much of their time keeping intimacy at bay, the departure forces them to confront what they've been avoiding all along: the cost of their distance. They may not have realized how much they relied on the anxious partner's pursuit to maintain a sense of connection. With that pursuit gone, the avoidant is left face to face with the emptiness created by their own withdrawal. That emptiness can become a powerful motivator, sparking the first real awareness that their defense mechanisms, while protective, are also deeply isolated. This moment can be painful, but pain has a way of breaking through denial. The avoidant may begin to reflect on their patterns, how they pull away when things get close, how they dismiss or minimize their partner's needs, how they confuse intimacy with suffocation. Without the anxious partner there to keep the cycle alive, the avoidant is left with silence, and silence is harder to escape than conflict. It lingers, it exposes, it asks questions they can no longer ignore. That silence can mark the beginning of change, because it forces the avoidant to realize that protecting themselves from closeness also means cutting themselves off from love. For the anxious partner, the catalyst looks different. Leaving gives them space to grow out of the patterns that made them feel powerless. Instead of obsessing over whether they're lovable, they start to ask themselves deeper questions. What do I truly need from a partner? What kind of relationship would feel safe and fulfilling for me? This shift reframes their entire approach to love. Instead of seeing themselves as someone who must work tirelessly to earn affection, they begin to recognize their own capacity to choose. Walking away doesn't just free them from the avoidance distance, it opens the door to relationships where their needs are respected, without negotiation. This catalyst also extends beyond romance. Both partners in their own way begin to re-examine how they show up in the world. The anxious partner might discover new confidence in friendships, careers, or creative pursuits, realizing they don't have to overextend themselves to be valued. The avoidant might notice how their patterns of withdrawal show up in other areas of life, avoiding vulnerability with friends, avoiding risks in work, avoiding opportunities that require commitment. The breakup becomes more than a personal loss, it becomes a mirror reflecting back the ways in which fear has shaped their choices. The beauty of this kind of catalyst is that it doesn't just close a chapter, it lays the groundwork for growth. For the avoidant, it can be the moment they finally start working toward genuine intimacy, instead of pushing it away. For the anxious partner, it's the moment they realize they were never too much. They were simply giving their love to someone who couldn't fully receive it. And in that realization, both are offered a chance to evolve, to step out of old patterns, and to move toward a version of love that is healthier, deeper, and more fulfilling than the one they left behind. When the anxious partner finally leaves the avoidant, the story isn't really about who won or who lost. It's about what each person discovers in the space that follows. The anxious partner finds freedom in realizing their worth was never tied to someone else's ability to love them. The avoidant is confronted with the silence they once thought they wanted, only to realize it carries a weight they never anticipated. Both are pushed toward growth, not because they wanted it, but because the dynamic left them no choice. The lesson here is powerful. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't holding on, it's letting go. It's choosing dignity over desperation, self-respect over self-doubt, and truth over fear. Relationships don't end to break us, they end to reveal us, to peel back the layers and show us who we really are when the patterns fall away. And in that discovery lies the possibility of transformation for both people, if they're willing to take it. So if you've ever been the anxious partner who finally walked away, know this: you didn't fail, you didn't give up too soon, and you weren't too much. You chose yourself, and that single choice has the power to change not only your relationships but your life. Thank you so much for being here, for listening, and for giving your time and heart to this message. Take care of yourself, honor your worth, and remember, you deserve the kind of love that doesn't make you question if you're enough. Goodbye for now, and thank you.